A few years ago now, I did some videos on underrated Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS games, and those videos led to a lot of people asking me when a list on 3DS games was coming. And honestly, I figured I'd never make that video because I didn't get into the 3DS ecosystem enough to really have a list of properly underrated titles for it. Though if you ask some people, my past lists weren't exactly underrated games either. Yeah, I read the comments, you jerks. But the 3DS was still a fantastic gaming system, and I wanted to show it some love since it's officially a retro handheld now. Plus, lately I've been revisiting a few of the games through the vastly improved Citra emulator, and it got me thinking about some of my all-time favorites. Unfortunately, I can't record footage in 3D to really sell some of these games, but if it helps, I can, throw some stuff at the camera to help you feel immersed. Like, you know, those gimmicky 3D movies that used to come out. Okay, I lied. I'm not gonna be throwing things at the camera. It's too expensive. So, even though we're not doing a proper list of underrated games, I do still have a few stipulations for the games I'm including in order to keep it authentic. For one, they have to be 3DS exclusives, so none of the random console ports like Yoshi's Woolly World or Hyrule Warriors, and also no enhanced versions of older games like Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask or Star Fox. I'm also not including any Pokemon games. Not because they're not worth it, but because I just didn't really connect with any of the Pokemon games on this system. Sun and Moon were neat, and I liked that gen's monsters, but the game itself didn't really click with me. I think it was something to do with the segmented region and the weird gimmick with the kahunas or whatever they were called. I don't even remember, honestly. There, that's your Pokemon review. Enjoy. So, without further ado, let's get to the first half of this list. This was a cute looking little puzzle game I thought looked interesting when it was first announced, but honestly, some of these block puzzles are extremely hard to figure out. I guess I'm just not the type of person that can wrap my head around them, so I don't have much to say about it, unfortunately, even though I really like it, and the satisfaction of finally getting a solution to a puzzle that's been stumping you can't be overstated. But basically, you play as the cute little Pushmo thing, and you have to push and pull the colored blocks to reach the goal. But there's only 3 lanes to work with, so figuring out what block needs to go where in order to get to the end hurts my brain more often than not, especially when you add in things like warp ladders. I still had to give it a shout out though, because it is great, and it spawns 2 more sequels that I never played since this one made me struggle so much, so it must have gotten a following in order to warrant more games. But, I mean, it's basically Catherine without all the sex, so play it. Actually, when I phrase it like that, I don't even want to play it, but you know what I mean. It's good.
Dylan's Rolling Wrestling.
Just like Pushmo, this is kind of a unique entry, because there's apparently 3 games in this series, but I only played the first one before kind of falling off the 3DS wagon and not really looking at the eShop digital titles anymore. So if those are better and more deserving of this spot, I'm sorry. Maybe I'll still play them. But for now, let's discuss this first game in the series. It's an interesting mix of gameplay styles, blending action RPG elements with tower defense and resource management. And while the gameplay loop starts to get old after a while, it's a fun game to jump into for a few levels at a time, in between other things. You play as the titular Dylan, an armadillo cowboy that seems almost like a Sonic knockoff, and you roll around the map arming sentries with different weapons to help take out the waves of enemies, breaking rocks and other obstacles to collect money, and raiding mineral deposits for supplies that can be sold or used to upgrade things. Then, when sunset hits, the enemy forces, known as Groks, come out in waves to break down the barricades to your home settlement and eat the villagers inside. Yeah, despite the cutesy graphics, it's pretty dark. Aside from setting up defense turrets, Dylan can also directly engage the Groks, which takes you to a battle map with the enemy forces. There are a few items he can use in combat, but the main attack is his rolling dash, which has to be charged to full power in order to avoid taking damage. This can be tricky since the enemies also charge at you and you're left vulnerable while building power, so attacking the enemies directly should really be a secondary measure. On the bottom screen, you can get a pretty good idea of where the enemies are headed, so it's best to focus on heading off the ones that aren't in a path to be destroyed by your defenses. Money management can be tough though, so it's fairly easy to get overwhelmed and feel like the enemies are twisting your arm... dillo. That was bad. I'm sorry. Let's move on.
Nintendogs and cats.
It's pretty well documented at this point, but the 3DS had a fairly rough launch. While that might be insane to think about 10 years later after knowing how successful it would become, I worked at Walmart for the actual system launch, and the game's lineup was... sad. But one standout was Nintendogs and Cats, which is a sequel to one of the cutest titles on the Nintendo DS. But as the title suggests, this one also brought in cats. I was pretty excited. The game was not only noticeably prettier than its predecessor, with more realistic animal behavior and some nice new fluffy textures, but there was also quite a bit more for the dogs to do, as well as introducing cats into the mix. Since I've never owned a dog myself, I was most curious to see how the two creatures would interact with each other in the virtual space. So, after an initial disappointment in having to build up money to buy a cat, to preface, you start out with enough money, but I accidentally did some shopping before figuring out where the cats were, and then didn't have enough to buy one. But eventually, I got one to match my real ginger kitties, and it turns out they emulated feline behavior a little too well, because the cats don't do much in the game. You can't take them on walks, or put them in the skill competitions, or anything like their canine counterparts, and while getting them to play with toys never gets old, the cat side of things felt a little hollow. Since I loved the original though, I was still pleasantly surprised by how much content there was with the dogs as you earn money to unlock other breeds, as well as various cosmetics, toys, etc. I chose the toy poodle version this time because it had corgis as a starting breed, and I friggin' love corgis. They're like the cats of the dog world, with their stretched out bodies, oversized cat ears, and little heart butts. I named mine Romano, as in Corgi Romano. I know, it's stupid, but I thought it was hilarious, so I don't really care what you think. Corgi Romano! It's great. Anyway, I was happy to see that the series' namesake was stronger than ever, even if the cats felt kind of like an afterthought in order to appeal to people like me. But I don't know, as an approximately 100% genuine human, maybe I'm just not the best judge of this game. Let's ask the professionals. Ridley. First of all, for the record, and remember, you are under oath, are you a cat? Suspicious. No response. Yeah, see? See that little roar there? I know what you really are, you little dragon in disguise. Weasley, in your professional cat opinion, how do you feel about Nintendogs? Riveting stuff. Gimli, you like other cats. Do you think the Nintendogs and cats is an accurate representation of your species? Speaking my mind. Well, that investigative journalism turned out fairly inconclusive. Oh, and Callie could not be reached for comment.
Kingdom Hearts Dream Drop Distance.
I know a lot of us, myself included, are still feeling pretty let down by Kingdom Hearts 3, but years before that disappointment released, we were all blessed with Kingdom Hearts 3D. See what I did there? Which has since been remastered in the Kingdom Hearts 2.8 collection, but while the low resolution on the 3DS release doesn't do it any favors, the game still looks and plays great on that system. It's kind of a strange game, because it has all the usual trappings of a time-filling spin-off. The story takes place in these weird dreamscapes that make it feel like nothing happening really matters, similar to past handheld titles like Chain of Memories and Recoded, but then the game also has a pretty dense story that even directly sets up some big end-game reveals for Kingdom Hearts 3, making it feel pretty necessary in the grand scheme. But, confusing plot aside, this game is also pretty refreshing because while there's less total worlds than any other game, it was marketed as featuring all original worlds. That's not entirely true, as Tron is technically a returning world, but it's so visually different from the one in Kingdom Hearts 2 that I can understand why they don't count that. It's a solid variety of new and old picks, though, with some underrepresented classics like Hunchback of Notre Dame, The Three Musketeers, and Fantasia making their first real appearances. And the worlds themselves are full of a surprising amount of detail and beautiful, varied environments. This honestly feels like a full home console sequel just shrunk down for portable resolution. Unlike past entries like Birth by Sleep that felt fairly bland and empty when brought to the big screen in the HD remaster. The gimmick of the game is interesting too, as you swap between Sora and Riku, each with their own special abilities and attacks. They have to work together to release these worlds from the dream state they're in, or something like that. Honestly, it's been a few years since I played through the whole thing, and Kingdom Hearts plots are hard enough to understand in the moment. But the swapping mechanic keeps things fresh, as each player has their own versions of the world with different tasks to complete, and very little repeated maps, surprisingly. So it helps make these worlds feel bigger and more fleshed out. Unlike in Kingdom Hearts 2, for example, where returning to a world you already beat just felt like mostly retreading filler. This is also the game that introduced the flow motion concept of interacting with the world, and while the controls can be a little clunky sometimes, especially since the screen size and camera don't do you any favors, the increased number of possible attack combinations, thanks to zipping around the room and bouncing off of walls and poles, makes combat the most fun it's ever been. Add in team-up attacks with your animal companions and some gimmicky but kinda neat touchscreen minigames to defeat enemies or sometimes solve puzzles, and you have an extremely dynamic battle system that's a far cry from Kingdom Hearts 2 and its hit triangle to win mechanic. Speaking of Sora's animal companions, the one area where I feel like this game falters is the monster capture gimmick. Rather than bringing Donald and Goofy along, you tame various enemies throughout the game and turn them into companions called Dream Eaters. These monsters can be leveled up, played with, etc., but it never feels all that deep and kinda just breaks up the pace when you have to go into the menu and buff their stats. There's also a silly photo mode gimmick with them, but you have so little control over their poses or anything that it's just kinda there. I never really liked this mechanic, and it seems my own animal companions aren't a fan either. But, for the most part, everything in this game, from the more obscure world choices, to the stellar production value, to the expanded combat system, all make it a great time. And hey, this one doesn't have any pointless gummy ship sections, just some pretty quick and simple drop sections leading into each level, where you fight bosses, take out enemies, or other objectives to open up the portal to the sleeping world. They're harmless and sometimes even fun. Plus, as a bonus, this is the only game on this list that you don't have to have a 3DS to play, since it was later ported to the Kingdom Hearts 2.8 HD collection, like I mentioned. So, you have no excuse not to give it a try.
Bravely Default.
In a recent underrated games video, I was suggested to try Final Fantasy IV Heroes of Light. And in that video, I basically said that game was an oversimplistic take on the Bravely Default formula before mentioning it actually spawned that series. So it's only fitting, now that we're on to 3DS games, that I discuss Bravely Default more in depth. Now, I'll be honest, from a presentation standpoint, this is a pretty standard RPG. You explore a world map, fight random encounters, level up your party, talk to NPCs, and complete objectives until you reach the game's big bad at the end. It's nothing new, and it's certainly not the best example of those things in action. The voice acting, for one, leaves something to be desired, but luckily you don't have to be subjected to that because I can't record 3DS games with sound anyway. Where the game differs, and excels, however, is in its combat system. This takes multiple creative licenses from the Final Fantasy series, not the least of which includes a lot of the naming schemes for items, but also the infamous job system fuels the bulk of the character progression in this game, and it's thankfully pretty expanded too. Each of your 4 party members can choose from a myriad of different jobs, while also equipping a subset of abilities they've learned from another job, and their appearance, stats, and combat abilities change based on the job. There's the traditional jobs, such as Black, White, and Red Mage, as well as Monk, Thief, etc. But then there's some really weird new options created for this game, like Pirate and Salve Maker. Salve? Salve? I think it's Salve. Let me know in the comments. They admittedly don't get as weird as they do in the sequel. I'm looking at you, Catmancer. But it's still nice to see them get creative with the jobs list to differentiate this from the Final Fantasy series. Anyway, as you level up the jobs, you unlock new abilities as well as special properties you can equip to the characters, such as raising attack or defense, or buffing other characters when hit. These go a long way to encouraging the player to try every job, as even if one doesn't sound interesting, it might have some abilities that seriously come in handy when you switch back to a different job. The battle system itself is a little trickier, as it deals with caching extra attack points, called default, or using extra points to get more attacks in one turn at the expense of losing future turns, called Brave. You use these two mechanics to try and take out the enemies as efficiently as possible. You even get bonus experience and treasure for finishing a battle in one turn, for example. So the best strategy for dealing with random encounters is usually just to brave every character for a full frontal assault, because you don't have to worry about the consequences when you win in one turn anyway. Because of that, boss battles are where the real challenge comes in, as you have to make sure you don't end up leaving your party vulnerable for multiple turns without any attacks, or some of these bosses will take everyone out with some seriously heavy-hitting attacks. And when it comes to attacking, there's a lot of options, aside from just normal weapon attacks and the job abilities you have equipped. There's also special attacks, which are tied to your currently equipped job that activate at certain points and not only deal massive damage, but also enact some kind of buff. So, finding the right time to use those is crucial to victory. And because it's a 3DS game, it has to have some silly Street Pass gimmick, which in this case takes the form of summoning friends as guest attackers. But these kind of options are great alternatives for characters that might not be very powerful attackers, such as a white mage in your party. Overall, there's a lot of dense mechanics in this game that make for a robust and interesting RPG experience, and it's icing on this Final Fantasy-inspired cake that the game is also really pretty, especially when the camera zooms out and shows you some beautiful hand-drawn environments, accented even more by the 3D effect, when applicable. It's very long, and the last third gets pretty grindy, but with 24 total jobs to obtain, there's almost always some side quest to go seek out on the main quest line gets boring, and these asterisk battles are a great example of how tough the combat strategy can get. But the reward of a new job is always worth it. That's the hallmark of a solid RPG. Now, if only they'll give us the sequel on Switch. 2020 is almost over, Square. Where is it? Good job on Final Fantasy 16, though. That looks great. I don't know who I'm talking to. No one at Square watches my videos. Which is a shame, because I pimp their stuff a lot. Speaking of...
Final Fantasy Explorers.
Remember how excited everyone got at the prospect of a Crystal Chronicles remake with online multiplayer? And then remember how disappointed most people were when they found out how terrible the actual multiplayer is, and without local multiplayer there was really no good way to play the game the way it was intended? Yeah, well, let me introduce Final Fantasy Explorers, a lesser-known online multiplayer take on the Final Fantasy license, but this one has more in common with games like Monster Hunter. You basically pick a job for your custom character, and then embark on different missions with your party to take down various enemies and eventually have full-on boss battles with classic Final Fantasy summon monsters. And those fights are really fun, I might add. Along the way, you take down other minions, find treasure, gain experience, you know, usual RPG stuff. After the missions, you can go back to the hub town to upgrade different equipment items, learn new abilities and spells, and more. This is unfortunately probably a tough sale now that the 3DS line has been discontinued, because it's a game that's definitely more fun with a good team of friends, but it's still enjoyable to grind out your hero and solo missions while waiting for the next time to squad up, and there's a good variety of jobs to test out to see what build works best for your playstyle. There's admittedly not much to the story, and if you're not generally into those Monster Hunter-style grinding games, there might not be much to grab onto, but I've never gotten into Monster Hunter, and I still had a really good time with friends. I think it helped, though, that it had the Final Fantasy license going for it. Taking down Ifrit and Shiva is way more fun than, like, random giant monsters I have no ties to. Oh, and I'd be remiss to not mention that I stole the footage for this game from a multiplayer Let's Play my friend Bloodshot Kai released, so there's plenty more of our gameplay shenanigans out there if you're curious about this game.
Dang it, let me rob you.
I don't think anyone would let you rob you if you tell them that.
Stop moving and let me rob you.
Well, at least you're being honest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm telling you exactly what the plan is. That's...
I'd hand over my purse.
yeah.
Seems legit. All right.
Let's go back a second. Where did this purse come from?
I don't know.
Unfortunately, we all got too busy to play together as much as we wanted, so I'd gladly revisit this game if anyone's interested. It's a pandemic. What else are you gonna do? Go outside? Good one. Yeah, you're gonna go out there with the COVID zombies, right?
The Legend of Zelda Triforce Heroes.
This game was definitely an underdog in the 3DS, and that's such a shame. But it was a tough sell because it was one of those weird examples where you could only play it alone or with two friends. No in between. And it wasn't really that fun alone because it required a lot of juggling AI companions, but if you got a good group together to run the game with you, it's honestly one of the most fun Zelda experiences you could have. The puzzles were all really clever and made great use of three people working together, along with new and returning items such as the hook shot, fire rod, and ice rod. And the bosses at the end of each world were pretty clever and also relied on teamwork to defeat. Sure, there would always be times when you would just screw over your friends because it's funny, but the game was just so fun to play together that I found myself naturally wanting to work together. Which, if you know my history with multiplayer games, is actually pretty unusual.
Hello. Yeah. Well, that didn't work anywhere near like I thought it was going to.
No.
You should have known that. I was just gonna let it
Let's
happen.
help. Let's help him.
Okay.
Let's just help him.
Push.
There he goes.
Like the last game, I actually stole all this footage from a Let's Play I did for my friends Metal Blade and Lazy Bum Gamer a few years ago when the game first came out. So, if this game interests you, I definitely recommend checking that out to see how much fun we had with this game.
Okay, we're gonna try this again.
Blow him alone, then blow
One.
me.
Yeah, I want to be blown
you can't-
alone.
You can't blow multiple people at once.
Well, you can, but you know, that's a lot of work, I would guess.
But only like one at a time.
Oh god, we're dying. Forgive this.
Yeah,
Screw this.
silence is probably the best answer to that.
Oh
No!
no! Princess, not again!
He's
We
so
actually
eager.
lost Flawless. No.
Come over.
It's not one I can really explain, but if you like other cooperative Zelda games like Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures, you kind of know what to expect with this. But I also think it's better than either of those games were. But I'd like to think our playthrough explains the game better than I could on my own.
Oh, eyeball away!
What the crap? Where's he going?
Shoot!
Get
Shoot
the
it!
eyeball.
Get
Get
He's gonna play
it.
ball with his eye.
it!
Get it.
Because he gets stunned when I hit him with the arrows.
Oh,
There he goes. Get him.
oh, that's
Stupid eyeball.
Oh
This is
god.
the moving on.
No! Got it.
Yeah.
Woo! Yeah!
You're so bro.
It is a shame, though, that more people didn't get to experience this together. Because I'd imagine if you just bought it as a single-player experience, you'd be extremely disappointed. But it allows for online co-op around the world, so it shouldn't be that hard to find a group. And if you are two of the people that owns it, hey, I still have my copy. Want to play? This is normally where I'd end the video with a, and there you have it. But we're not done yet, folks. See that part 1 in the title? I'll be back soon with the top 7, so if you don't see your favorite 3DS game here, just wait. It's probably still to come. Unless it's Pokemon. We already discussed that. Still sorry. But, in the meantime, let me know your thoughts on these 7, and shout out some of your favorite games. I won't tell you if they're still to come, but I'm happy to gush about how great this system's library was. I mean, it's not as good as the DS with its GBA backwards compatibility, but it's still pretty good. It's really only held back by how many 3DS games actually originated on other consoles. Pretty much every unique 3DS game is gold. It was hard to narrow down the list. But that's all for me right now. I gotta get to work on part 2. This is probably where I should end the video with some cool 3D effect, but that takes a lot of work, and no one makes it this far anyway. It's fine. Cut to black. I still had to give it a shout out though, because it's great and spawned 2 sequels that I never played since this one made me struggle so much. Really? Really. I'm goofy. Just goofy. I'm Lucy Goofy. Oh, yeah? That was a bad Goofy impersonation. The voice acting, for one, leaves something to be desired, but luckily you don't have to be... But luckily you don't have to be subject... I wonder how many of my bloopers are just mouth noises. Here's your ASMR for the day. So, there's plenty more of our gameplay shenanigans up.